alcohol can be a gas. David is next on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast to Coast. I'm George Norrie here in the cave in St. Louis. David Blume, alcohol can be a gas. David, I wanted to get your reaction, first of all, to this story about where has all the oil gone. I'm sure it's around somewhere. There's no way bacteria could have eaten all that stuff, right?
Well, actually, that's actually not necessarily true, George, because
really?
There are many bacteria that look at things like hydrocarbons, almost like carbohydrates, and do eat oil. And, of course, once they begin eating it, they reproduce more and more and more. So you'll generally find these bacteria, though, not so much in the ocean, although there are some that do eat oil. And quite frankly, there are many small seeps all over the Gulf Ocean floor, but that oil never makes it to the surface because bacteria have adapted to live that mile deep under the ocean and actually cluster around these little tiny seeps and eat the oil before it actually can float up. So, the idea of bacteria eating oil is not just an idea, but it's a really important fact because we'd be swimming in waste oil if we didn't have those bacteria. I mean, all the spills we've talked about over time, billions and literally billions of gallons of oil.
Yeah.
Like the Exxon Valdez only cleaned up 2 or 3% of the oil that dumped up there in those frigid waters. And if it wasn't for bacteria eating that oil, it would still be an awful mess. So I think what we're seeing mostly, though, in the situation in the Gulf is the continuing effect of the toxic dispersants, because so much of that oil was actually dosed with dispersants on the ocean floor, and some of it that's reached the surface is mixed with this stuff that breaks it up into small particles. So although it looks like the oil's gone, it's still there on the surface, but not so visible as a red, orange, or even black, slick. So yes, you still see tar balls because the bacteria has a harder time eating those heavier compounds. But, over time, the Gulf oil, if we don't have another blowout, will slowly but surely, clean up, by natural bacteria eating it. Although that will take, decades to fully be effective.
Right.
Now, the reason is that there's not enough other stuff in the water for the bacteria to live on because they can't live on oil alone. So they need things like phosphorus and nitrogen and, hydrocarbons only have hydrogen and carbon. So when you reach the limit of these other important nutrients, that's all the oil the bacteria can eat, and the bacteria start to die. And that's the problem because they have a short lifespan, and when they die, they decompose and use up oxygen as they rot. So the Gulf already had a big problem with bacteria using up oxygen seasonally in the Gulf. And that means when you use up the oxygen, things like oysters and fish and other animals, that breathe with gills, absorb oxygen out of the water, those all die, crabs, etc., when the oxygen is gone.
Are we beginning to see signs of massive deterioration out there in the Gulf in terms of fish life and things like that?
Yes, the oxygen content in the Gulf water is dropping because many things have been eating the oil and then decomposing. For instance, maybe 3 times as much methane or natural gas has been coming out of the spill as oil itself. And there are lots of bacteria that like to eat methane. And so the methane actually is slowly moving to the surface because so much of the methane became methane icy slush at deeper depths, even 3,000 and 4,000 feet below the surface. So huge colonies of bacteria are slowly eating all of that and using up the oxygen at multiple depths in the water. And, there's a lot of things that spawn literally on the bottom of the ocean, and as we use up the oxygen, those things die.
David, I'm beginning to sense, too, that mainstream media is kind of tucking this story on the back burner now because it appears to be capped. I'm concerned about that.
Well, we ought to be, because this spill has covered over 15,000 square miles of the Gulf. The toxicity is not going to disappear overnight. It's going to take decades for it to all go away. And there's one disaster, one either disaster or a calamity after another happening. I mean, the oystermen who have been, making their living for generations in the Gulf, reading accounts from them today, most of them are African American. And BP, for some strange reason, doesn't seem to hire African American oystermen. They're only hiring oystermen that look a lot like the British. What can I say? So there's actual racism going on right now in the hiring of these people, and these are the people that are going out of business in the Gulf. And it's a violation of U.S. law. Discrimination based on race is something we're very proud of stopping in this country, and here we have a transnational corporation ignoring that law and visiting even more tragedy in the Gulf.
Well, maybe this new chairman, when he takes over in October, might recognize this and fix this problem, huh?
Well, George, from other shows how I feel about corporate organization. I know. They stamp these guys all out of the same mold. So we can hope that some of these, things get cleaned up in the change of administration. But it's a basic feature of corporations to, control and determine how we hear the news and who gets to do what and who's, quite frankly, willing to shut up for the money. And we have the problem now of BP looking at the real threat of literally, $75 to $100 billion in fines for, under the Clean Water Act. So the response is not to say, gosh, we're really sorry and we're going to spend even more money cleaning it up and, maybe you'll give us a lighter sentence, so to speak. Now what they're doing is buying up all the oceanographers and fish experts and everyone they can find in the Gulf, paying them roughly $250 an hour to be consultants, and therefore they're not objective anymore when it comes to testifying. The government's going to have a hard time finding anyone to testify against BP because the pay is so good working for them.
That's so true. What's new with alcohol can be a gas, David?
Oh, gosh, all kinds of things are going on in the world of alcohol. We're seeing, blender pumps spring up around the country, and Underwriters Laboratory has now certified them, so they're insurable. And that's, it sounds like a small technical detail, but we've been working on this for years with underwriters dragging their feet and not certifying these things, and finally we're embarrassed into it. So what this means is that people can, in many places like Kansas or Minnesota and South Dakota, and more states all the time, you can pull up to the pump and you can punch in how much alcohol you want to put in your car. So you can punch up 30% or 50%, and the other half being, gasoline.
That's fantastic.
Oh, it's enormously frightening for the oil companies. They've been fighting the blender pump thing for 10 years because what we saw in Brazil, where people are a little bit less addicted to convenience, is that when alcohol became half the price of gasoline under the Bush administration, people started mixing it in their car. Put a little of that in and put a little of this in. And, it was kind of a joke. They were calling it rabo de gallo, which is a Brazilian term for a cocktail made of multiple beverages. So, what they were doing is finding out what their car would run on, and people found out that, the half-price alcohol worked very well at half the amount of, fuel for the tank. So running a 50% mixture meant no conversion, no changes in the car, and people were able to save a lot of money. And, of course, alcohol being 105 octane saved people who need premium even more. So within 7 or 8 years now, the Brazilian population has gone to 95% fueling with alcohol, straight alcohol now. But it all started with people mixing it at the pump and realizing their cars would run on it. So the oil companies are terrified that Americans will discover the same thing, and blender pumps make it so easy because you don't have to fill up, say, half on gasoline and then go a few feet to the alcohol pump and then fill up halfway on that.
You do it all right there.
Yes, you can just go ahead and punch in what you want and fill it up, and the oil companies are fighting back in big ways, but they